So you want to own America's whiskey business. In the years after the Civil War, it looked like one of the greatest businesses in the country. Demand was almost unlimited. Every city had saloons. Every frontier town had taverns. Hotels stocked it. Railroad workers drank it. Farmers traded it. Doctors prescribed it. Soldiers bought it. Unlike luxury goods, whiskey wasn't a product reserved for the wealthy. It was consumed by nearly every class of American society. That meant one thing for entrepreneurs: reliable cash flow. If you were a distillery owner in the 1870s, you appeared to own the perfect business. Your raw materials, corn, rye, wheat, and barley, were abundant. Transportation was becoming cheaper thanks to expanding railroads. America's rapidly growing population created an ever larger customer base. From the outside, the economics looked extraordinary. Produce whiskey. Pay your federal tax. Sell your barrels. Collect your profits. Repeat. Simple. At least that's what the government believed. The reality was very different. Behind the polished ledgers and official tax stamps existed one of the largest organized corruption networks in American history. The business wasn't generating extraordinary profits because whiskey was valuable. It was generating extraordinary profits because taxes weren't being paid. Government inspectors accepted bribes. Federal tax collectors falsified records. Warehouse operators hid inventory. Politicians protected the operation. Distillers reported only a fraction of their actual production. Millions of dollars that should have entered the U.S. Treasury disappeared before anyone realized the scale of the fraud. The whiskey ring wasn't merely a criminal conspiracy. It was an economic failure. It exposed how even the strongest tax systems become vulnerable when incentives reward corruption instead of honesty. More importantly, it demonstrated a timeless lesson. The greatest threat to government revenue isn't always economic recession. Sometimes it's the people hired to protect that revenue. To understand how one of America's largest tax scandals became possible, we first need to understand why whiskey mattered so much to the federal government. Unlike many businesses we've covered in this series, the whiskey ring wasn't a single company. It wasn't even a formal organization. It was an underground economic network built around one of America's most profitable industries. To understand its economics, we need to define the asset. The first asset was the distillery itself. After the Civil War, thousands of licensed distilleries operated across the United States. Some were small rural producers. Others were industrial facilities capable of producing thousands of gallons every week. Each gallon legally produced generated federal excise taxes. The second asset was the bonded warehouse. Federal law required much of the whiskey to be stored under government supervision before entering the market. These warehouses became critical control points because taxes depended on accurately recording inventory. The third asset was the internal revenue system. Revenue collectors, inspectors, warehouse supervisors, treasury agents. Unlike modern automated tax systems, 19th century enforcement depended almost entirely on human oversight. That made the system vulnerable. Finally came the most valuable asset of all: political protection. Certain officials possessed the authority to delay inspections, overlook discrepancies, approve reports, or discourage investigations. That protection became worth more than any physical building. The whiskey ring, therefore, wasn't selling whiskey. It was selling access. Access to dishonest inspectors, access to fraudulent accounting, access to political influence. Together, these assets created a business model capable of generating extraordinary illegal returns with relatively little operational risk, at least while the conspiracy remained hidden. The value of the operation didn't come from producing more alcohol. It came from reducing one of the industry's largest expenses: taxes. Unlike modern businesses that begin with venture capital or institutional financing, entering America's whiskey industry during the 1870s required substantial physical investment. The first requirement was land. Successful distilleries typically located themselves near grain-producing regions, navigable rivers, railroad connections, or rapidly growing cities. Transportation costs mattered enormously. Corn weighed far more than finished whiskey. Building close to farms reduced raw material costs, while locating near railroads lowered distribution expenses. Industrial land in cities like St. Louis, Cincinnati, Louisville, Chicago, and Milwaukee commanded significantly higher prices because those locations connected producers directly to national markets. But purchasing land represented only the beginning. A medium-sized commercial distillery required substantial capital expenditures before producing its first barrel. Large brick buildings, boiler houses, fermentation rooms, copper stills, storage warehouses, water wells, steam engines, barrel-making facilities, loading platforms. Depending on scale, establishing a serious commercial distillery could require investments equivalent to several $1 million in today's purchasing power. Financing often came from local banks, private investors, wealthy merchants, or partnerships between experienced distillers. Yet none of these represented the industry's greatest cost. The largest recurring expense was federal excise taxation. For many producers, taxes represented a larger financial burden than grain, labor, transportation, or maintenance combined. Economically, taxes functioned almost like today's operating expenses, except they weren't optional. Unless, of course, someone inside the government agreed otherwise. This is where legitimate business economics ended and criminal economics began. Distillers quickly realized something important. Avoiding taxes produced a far greater return on investment than improving production efficiency. Why spend years increasing output by 10% when bribing one inspector could increase profits by 50%? That simple calculation became the foundation of the whiskey ring. It transformed tax avoidance into one of the highest return investments available in post-Civil War America. The conspiracy wasn't driven by greed alone. It was driven by incentives. And incentives often determine economic behavior more powerfully than laws. By the early 1870s, dozens of distilleries across multiple states had reached the same conclusion. If government oversight could be purchased, tax compliance became optional. When we think of capital expenditures or CapEx, we usually imagine physical assets: factories, machinery, warehouses, vehicles, equipment. Those were certainly necessary for the whiskey industry. A large commercial distillery in the 1870s required expensive copper stills, massive steam boilers, grain elevators, fermentation tanks, barrel warehouses, pumping systems, horses, wagons, and railroad loading facilities. Every expansion required new capital. Every additional still increased production capacity. Every warehouse allowed more inventory to age before shipment. These were legitimate business investments. But the whiskey ring had another kind of capex. It invested in people. The conspiracy's most valuable infrastructure wasn't made of brick or steel. It was built through relationships. Bribes became recurring investments. Political donations purchased influence. Government appointments created loyal insiders. Local revenue agents received regular payments to ignore discrepancies. Warehouse supervisors altered inventory records. Tax inspectors approved false production reports. Lawyers handled legal challenges before they became criminal investigations. In economic terms, the whiskey ring transformed corruption into productive capital. Every dollar spent bribing an official generated many more dollars in unpaid taxes. Imagine a distillery legally producing 10,000 gallons of whiskey. If federal taxes amounted to roughly $0, 70 per gallon, a significant tax at the time, the owner owed about $7,000 to the treasury. But suppose corrupt officials reported only 6,000 gallons. The government collected only $4,200. The remaining $2,800 stayed inside the conspiracy. Multiply that by hundreds of production cycles across dozens of distilleries. Now multiply it across several years. The result wasn't thousands of dollars, it was millions. The fraud became remarkably scalable because the administrative infrastructure already existed. The government had already built the tax collection system. The whiskey ring simply hijacked it. Instead of constructing an entirely illegal operation from scratch, participants quietly redirected an existing government process for private profit. This dramatically reduced operational costs. Unlike organized smuggling operations, there was little need for secret transportation routes or hidden factories. The whiskey itself was perfectly legal. The paperwork wasn't. Another hidden investment involved information. Members constantly shared inspection schedules, audit procedures, personnel changes, Treasury communications, political developments in Washington. Knowing when inspectors would arrive often proved more valuable than producing additional whiskey. The conspiracy operated almost like a modern corporation. It maintained communication networks, distributed profits, protected its members, managed operational risk, solved internal disputes, and expanded into new territories whenever opportunities appeared. From a purely economic perspective, the whiskey ring demonstrates an uncomfortable truth. The most profitable businesses aren't always those with the best products. Sometimes they're the ones that most effectively manipulate institutions. Building the corruption network was only the beginning. Keeping it alive required constant spending. Every successful business has operating expenses. The whiskey ring was no different. Its OPEX simply looked very different from that of a legitimate company. First came ordinary production costs. Grain had to be purchased. Workers needed wages. Boilers consumed fuel. Barrels required replacement. Buildings demanded maintenance. Transportation costs increased as railroads expanded. Insurance protected facilities from fire. Equipment regularly failed under heavy use. These expenses affected every honest distillery, but members of the whiskey ring faced an entirely different category of operating costs: bribes. Bribes weren't occasional expenses. They became recurring operational expenditures. Revenue collectors expected regular payments. Inspectors required compensation for falsified reports. Warehouse officials demanded their share. Political intermediaries received commissions for maintaining protection. In effect, corruption became another line item in the business budget. The irony was remarkable. Many owners considered bribery more predictable than taxation. Taxes fluctuated with production. Bribes simply became part of the cost of doing business. Another major expense involved secrecy. Communication had to remain secure. Financial records required manipulation. Witnesses needed reassurance. Potential whistleblowers had to be monitored. Legal counsel became increasingly important as rumors spread. The larger the conspiracy grew, the more expensive it became to maintain internal trust. Economists call this an agency problem. Whenever multiple individuals cooperate illegally, every participant possesses valuable information that could destroy the entire organization. Loyalty, therefore, becomes expensive. The whiskey ring continuously purchased silence. It also faced competitive pressures. Not every distillery participated. Honest producers paid full federal taxes. Initially, this placed them at a severe disadvantage. A corrupt distillery avoiding thousands of dollars in taxes could either undercut competitors on price or simply earn much larger profit margins. Either option distorted competition. Efficient businesses lost customers to dishonest ones. Markets gradually rewarded corruption instead of productivity. This represents one of corruption's greatest economic costs. It doesn't merely steal public money. It redirects capital toward businesses that excel at bribery rather than innovation. Investors notice. Entrepreneurs notice. Eventually, honest firms begin questioning whether integrity remains economically rational. At that point, corruption starts spreading beyond individual companies. It becomes systemic. The whiskey ring had reached exactly that stage by 1874. It no longer relied on isolated, dishonest officials. Entire regional networks operated together. Each participant understood that everyone became wealthier as long as the system remained hidden. The greatest risk wasn't government taxation. It was someone deciding to tell the truth. Unlike a normal company, the whiskey ring didn't create a new product. It monetized tax avoidance. That distinction is important. A legitimate distillery generated revenue through whiskey sales. The whiskey ring generated additional profit by preventing money from reaching the U.S. Treasury. Its primary revenue stream came from underreporting production. Every hidden barrel represented taxes never collected. Customers still paid full market prices. Retailers still earned profits. Distributors still transported whiskey. The only missing participant was the federal government. Secondary revenue emerged through market distortion. Distilleries participating in the scheme enjoyed significantly lower effective operating costs. Some sold whiskey below competitors' prices while maintaining higher profit margins. Others simply kept prices unchanged and pocketed the difference. Either strategy proved enormously profitable. Imagine a medium-sized operation producing 100,000 gallons annually. If excise taxes averaged approximately $0, $70 per gallon, annual tax liability approached $70,000, an enormous sum in the 1870s. Now assume corrupt officials concealed 40% of actual production. The Treasury collected taxes on only 60,000 gallons. The remaining 40,000 gallons generated roughly $28,000 in illegally retained tax savings. Adjusted for inflation, that represents hundreds of thousands of dollars today from a single operation. Expand that model across dozens of distilleries operating for several years. The missing revenue quickly reached millions. These weren't accounting errors. They were deliberate financial transfers from taxpayers to private conspirators. The whiskey ring essentially created an underground profit center financed entirely by stolen public revenue. From an investor's perspective, the returns appeared extraordinary. Low additional capital requirements, minimal production changes, high recurring profits, limited regulatory enforcement, political protection. Until eventually, those assumptions failed. Because every fraudulent business model depends on one dangerous belief, that nobody will ever look closely enough. For the whiskey ring, that belief was about to be tested by one determined man inside the Treasury Department. Every business faces risk. Legitimate companies worry about recessions, rising costs, competition, or changing consumer demand. The whiskey ring faced something far more dangerous: exposure. For nearly 4 years, the conspiracy operated with remarkable confidence. Distillers believed their political connections were untouchable. Revenue agents assumed manipulated records would never be questioned. Politicians trusted that loyal allies would protect them if rumors surfaced. But corruption has a hidden operating cost. The larger the network becomes, the harder it is to control. Every new participant creates another potential witness. Every forged ledger creates another piece of evidence. Every bribe leaves another financial trail. And every dollar stolen gives investigators another reason to keep digging. By 1874, the federal government began noticing irregularities that simple accounting mistakes couldn't explain. Certain distilleries purchased enormous quantities of grain, but reported surprisingly low whiskey production. Others generated unusually high profits despite paying relatively little tax. Warehouse inventories often failed to match shipping records. Something wasn't adding up. The greatest threat wasn't the missing money itself. It was that the fraud had become too successful. Millions of dollars had disappeared from the Treasury. That scale attracted attention. Treasury Secretary Benjamin Bristow understood that ordinary audits would never uncover the full conspiracy because the inspectors conducting those audits were often part of the fraud. Instead of announcing an investigation, Bristow quietly built one. Trusted investigators gathered evidence in secret. Financial records were compared across multiple states. Railroad shipping manifests were matched against warehouse inventories. Grain purchases were compared with reported production. Bank transactions were traced. Telegrams were intercepted. The government wasn't looking for one dishonest distillery. It was searching for an entire criminal ecosystem. The whiskey ring had underestimated one critical risk. It believed political influence could permanently outweigh financial evidence. History would prove otherwise. Unlike previous episodes in this series, no billionaire was purchasing a physical asset. There was no hotel, no casino, no data center. The asset being acquired was something even more valuable: control. Jay Goode attempted to corner the gold market. The whiskey ring attempted to corner the government's tax collection system. The economics were surprisingly similar. Rather than increasing production, participants increased profits by capturing value that belonged to someone else. From a purely financial perspective, the return on investment appeared extraordinary. A relatively small network of corrupt officials generated millions in illegal gains without constructing new factories, inventing new technology, or expanding consumer demand. The operation exploited institutional weakness instead of creating economic value. That distinction is important. Real wealth comes from increasing productivity. Corruption simply redistributes existing wealth. In the short term, participants became richer. In the long term, society became poorer. Money that should have funded infrastructure, veterans' pensions, debt repayment, and reconstruction instead financed lavish lifestyles, political patronage, and criminal enterprises. The scandal also revealed another timeless economic lesson. Investors don't simply require profitable businesses. They require confidence that markets operate fairly. When corruption becomes widespread, honest entrepreneurs begin questioning whether innovation still matters. Why invest in better equipment if competitors simply bribe inspectors? Why improve efficiency if illegal operators avoid their largest expenses? Eventually, Capital flows toward political influence rather than productive investment. That transition weakens long-term economic growth. The whiskey ring, therefore, wasn't merely stealing tax revenue. It was quietly reducing America's future economic potential. In May 1875, Benjamin Bristow acted. Federal agents launched coordinated raids across multiple cities. Distilleries were seized, warehouses searched, financial records confiscated. Dozens of arrests followed almost immediately. The conspiracy unraveled with astonishing speed. More than 230 people were indicted. Over 100 convictions followed. Several of the nation's most influential revenue officials lost their positions. Millions of dollars in fraudulent activity were uncovered. The investigation eventually reached the White House itself. President Ulysses S. Grant's private secretary, Orville E. Babcock, was accused of participating in the conspiracy. Although Babcock was ultimately acquitted, the political damage proved enormous. Grant refused to believe one of his closest friends had betrayed him. His loyalty became one of the defining controversies of his presidency. Public confidence suffered. Citizens questioned whether corruption had spread throughout the federal government. Congress demanded reforms. Treasury procedures changed. Record-keeping improved. Independent oversight expanded. Future tax investigations became far more sophisticated. The whiskey ring fundamentally transformed federal tax enforcement. Economically, its lessons extended far beyond whiskey. Governments around the world eventually recognized